Hello out there in the world of literacy and learning. My name is Elizabeth Lacy. I am a lifelong lover of reading and writing. I have taught reading and writing for many years, and now I am a teacher and literacy coach. Today I am going to be talking to you about ways to rethink the way we use rubrics, specifically rethinking the way we're getting students to use rubrics and using them for their own learning sake as opposed to our grading sake. If you have questions, comments, great ideas, or any other thoughts, you can see the hashtag, the EdCollab Gathering, and this is session 16, so please tweet those in. I will be watching for them throughout the session. So I'm going to start, and I wanted to share with you this idea that I wanted to rethink rubric use for a couple of reasons. I want us to talk today specifically about how students can use rubrics for goal setting, for differentiation, and for their own defense of their learning. When I started this work, it's because I realized these are some things I have been taught about rubrics. So throughout the years, as educators, we are taught how to create a rubric. We are taught how to use a rubric as teachers to norm looking at student work. But then the learning about how to show students how to use rubrics sort of stops with the good old chocolate chip cookie lesson, where we show students this is a rubric to measure a chocolate chip cookie, and it gets a 2 if it has some chocolate chips and a 3 if it has lots of chocolate chips. And from there, we then sort of slip into a couple of things. And I feel like over the years, I've taught students what a rubric is, and when we ask them what it is, they say it's the thing you grade us on, or it's how we know how we're doing. So I wanted to know more about how do I get students to not only understand a rubric, which I do feel like we do some of in the world. I don't want them just to understand it, though. I want them to actually use it as a stepping stone for their own growth. The problems that I saw, so there's 2 typical rubric moves that myself and many of my colleagues over the years have done. The first typical rubric move we do is we start at the beginning of a writing unit with the best of intentions. We give students a rubric. If we're really good, we have students look at a mentor text alongside the rubric, and we have them talk about the qualities. Then unfortunately from there, if you're me, what you did in the past was then you would have the students put the rubric in their writing folder, where it would sit most of the time until near the end of the writing unit. Of course, at the end of each writing unit, I started to wonder why didn't they use their rubric more to improve their draft? If they knew how I was using it to grade them, why weren't they using it to improve their work? The other typical rubric move I feel like I did a lot was I would give students the whole rubric near the end of the revision. So I would hold on to it, and then near the end, I would give them their rubric. I would ask them to grade themselves on the rubric as part of their reflection for student learning. The students would score themselves on the rubric and then turn it in. And in this situation, the rubric became sort of a finite judgment. So this is where I am, instead of a tool for growth and a way to get somewhere else that they wanted to be. So once again, I was left wondering, why didn't they better use their rubric to evaluate themselves, and why weren't they using it to improve what they were trying to do? So I said, let's try something new. And so my goal became to start looking at rubrics in smaller chunks along the way. And I said, let's take it one row, one small section at a time, and let's use it throughout the process. So what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you a little bit about what that looks like in terms of what the actual rubric looks like. And then I want to show you how I would actually model students using this with their work. So you're going to bear with me for 1 second as I screen share. I have to shift documents. We haven't quite figured out how to shift smoothly from one thing to another. So I'm going to first show you, for the examples of this demonstration, I'm going to show you the whole rubric first. So this is what my typical rubric move was. So in this case, you're seeing a 6th grade personal narrative rubric, and as you can see, there are a whole lot of words and categories and things on this page. and especially for some of our more developing writers and for English language learners and for students with speech and language issues, it's no wonder that they didn't use all of this to actually help move their work forward. So we said, let's try something different. And so instead, we switched to using a document that looked a little bit more like this. Now, in this case, what you're looking at is just one isolated row of the rubric. So in this particular day and in this particular lesson, I wanted to show students how to look at the beginnings of their stories. And I know we say that a lot as writing teachers. I'm going to show you to look at the beginning of your story, but I wanted specifically for them to look at the beginning of their story in comparison to how they were going to be evaluated on the beginning of their story, because I wanted them to critique it for themselves. I wanted them to think, is my story meeting the criteria? Is my story in line with what, story writers across 6th grades are doing? So I started planning this and teaching this in a couple of ways. So again, bear with me one more time. I'm going to switch to a document camera, and I'm going to show you what this actually looks like to plan and teach this out with students. So when I'm planning to teach students about rubric work and students about moving throughout the rubric work, I am actually going to use the rubric and the row of the rubric to create a checklist for myself. And when I was initially looking at this, I was thinking about how oftentimes when we model our writing, we start by immediately modeling the level we want them to meet when we're done writing. And for a lot of my students, if it's the first time ever writing a story or if it's their first time really trying to push themselves, I wanted to create more of a stair stepper. I wanted to create more ways for them to slowly move up to where it was and for them to take one step at a time, because I felt often they were at the bottom of the staircase and I was showing them the very top and I was wondering why they weren't just walking up the stairs. So what I did was I looked at what we said a level 1, 2, and 3 beginning was. And when I was planning out my beginning, I was actually looking at between a level 2 and a 3, because I said to myself, I want to get at somewhere between those two so I have somewhere that I go. So I made a checklist for myself of things, when I'm planning my own model, things I wanted to do. So I knew I wanted to be at about the level 2 when I started class. And so for 6th grade, we had said that at a level 2, you did describe what's happening in your story. And you did describe where it was happening, and you gave some clue to the action. So I started out, and here's my level 2 beginning. I'm telling a story about my friend Natalie and I who were sort of overly creative when we went to play in the park, and we ended up causing a whole lot of trouble. So here's my beginning at a level 2. I said, all right, so I know that I need to describe what's happening, describe where, and give a clue to the action. And as I planned and wrote each part of this, I used it as a checklist for myself. So I said, okay, I'm going to describe what's happening and where. Natalie and I were forced to play at Nettie Schultz Park. The park was super lame, with an old slide and a merry-go-round and a few swings. We had wanted to go do something really fun for spring break, but we're stuck trying to find things to do. So I'm going to show this to my students, and I'm going to ask them what they see. And I'm going to say, is this, if I'm just worried about the beginning, I'm not worried about the whole rubric, I'm not worried about how I'm doing overall, I'm just worried about the beginning. Of course, obviously this level 2 part, they wouldn't see that. And I would ask them to really look at and evaluate, and they would eventually come up with, yeah, I think this is about the level 2. And this is the step that I feel like I was missing before that became really key, which was, okay, so then what do I need to do as a writer to move to that level 3? Because there's some very specific things that I could do that would make my writing so much better. So the first thing that I looked at and the first thing I said I could do is the rubric here for level 3 says I used many details to describe who, when, where, and what. So I'm going to actually make some goals. I'm going to make some notes to myself of things I need to do. And I'm going to say many details. And in particular, I want to make sure that I tell who, when, where, and what. The second thing that this one says that I'm not sure I've done yet is it says that I've got to hint, I've got to move the story forward by hinting at a bigger problem or idea. So I'm going to put, I need a hint, I hope it's interesting, a hint about the problem or the idea. So in the past, I might have waited to do this till the very end with the students, but unfortunately at the very end, they're looking at several rows and several different things, and it's very hard to make this specific task list for myself, this specific checklist of things I could do for lots and lots of categories at once. But right now, I'm doing it, I'm just worried about my beginning, and so I'm going to say, all right, I know I need to try this again. So I'm going to model for the students. I'm actually going to draw a line on my paper, or if I'd written more of my story, I might write it on the back. And I'm going to try this again. But this time, I want to make sure that I've got many details. I've got lots of details about who was there. And when I do that, I'm going to check that off. And then I want many details about when it happened. And when I do that, I'm going to check it off. So I would actually model writing a little of this with the students. And I would use this as a physical checklist. When I do these things, I'm going to check them off so that I know I'm moving closer to grade level or closer to what sixth graders should be able to do as I'm writing this. So I'm going to start again. So last time I had just said Natalie and I were forced to go to Nettie Schultz Park. The park was super lame with an old slide and a merry-go-round. This time, I'm going to say something more along the lines of, when we were younger, Nettie Schultz Park seemed okay. But my best friend, so already I'm paying more attention to the who. I want to be more specific. My best friend, Natalie, and I were growing older. So again, I'm being more specific about the situation. We're getting older. We're best friends. We wanted fun and adventure. Okay. So I would model more of that, and I'm going to show you what my finished modeling of this section looked like the second time around. So my finished modeling the second time around looks like this. When we were younger, Nettie Schultz Park seemed pretty great. But my best friend Natalie and I were growing older. We wanted fun and adventure. On that early morning of spring break, so again, I'd be more specific about when, on that early morning of spring break, when we were forced out of the house and to the playground, the park seemed especially lame. The slide was shiny in some spots but dull in others, with a few small dents in the surface. The merry-go-round was slightly tilted towards the dirt in the ground, with hints of rust on the bars. Even the grass was crunchy and brown. Natalie flopped her skinny butt down on the ground, so being again more specific with my who, Natalie flopped her skinny butt down on the ground and stared around as if she was a kitten about to claw the couch. So I'm hinting that what we're about to do, this big idea, is not just any kind of something that we're going to find. When a kitten claws the couch, they're causing trouble. I'm so bored. We have to find something exciting to do. So now I'm going to go back to these goals that I set, to this checklist that I used. And I'm going to say, well, yeah, I think I talked more about the who because I explained that she was my best friend, and I described the fact that she was skinny. And I'm going to get into more details throughout. This is just the beginning. I feel that I did a better job with the when because now I've explained that it's early morning and that it's part of spring break. So I'm going to go ahead and check off the when. I think I did a much better job with the where. I've explained that this is a super lame, not fun park because I've got the slide descriptions, I've got the merry-go-round, I've got the dirt, I've got the crunchy brown grass. And I'm going to connect this what and this hint about the problem because the what is that we're at the park, but more importantly, the problem or this big idea that's coming, which is that we're going to cause some trouble because that's what children do when we're bored, right? So I've hinted about that. Now, I haven't said we were going to the park and we were about to cause trouble, but I've hinted at it because I've set up this idea that she was like a kitten clawing a couch, and I've also set up this line of dialogue. I'm so bored. I have to find something exciting to do. So I've used this one piece of the rubric, and I looked at where I was at the beginning, which was here. I described what was happening, I gave a where, and I gave a little clue to the action, but it was pretty boring. And then I thought to myself, how do I move from here to here? What do I have to do? And I made a list, a task list for myself of things that I was going to now go and do. Now, why didn't I just start here? Why didn't I just model at this 3 to begin with? And I started by thinking to myself, one, we really want our kids to get in this habit of constantly revising their work, of just starting by getting something down on paper and then constantly revising forward. So that was one reason why I wanted to start at the level 2, because I wanted something very accessible so they could all get something on the paper. So I started with my lower level modeling here because I just wanted them to sort of start the process. And I wanted them early on in the writing process, not at the end, not when we're almost done, but here's this giant rubric. But early on in the process, I wanted them looking at their work, realizing that there was more that they could do, and then moving their work up to that higher level, using just one column of the rubric at the time, using one idea. So this worked pretty well. It worked better than the tricks I'd tried before of just giving it out at the beginning or giving it out at the end, and found that a lot of students were able to move from there. However, we also found that some students were not quite ready even for this whole class level. So in a classroom where we have a mixture of students that are 2 to 3 years actually ready and above grade level, all the way down to emerging readers and writers in one room, this really wasn't in and of itself enough. And so what we found was we said, okay, let's take it even further. Let's break it down even more. 4 columns is a lot. 4 columns of looking at criteria is actually a lot. And if a student is all the way down at the level 1, then trying to look at that 2 and 3 and 4 all at the same time is too much. So we started then looking at this idea of stations work, of breaking it down to just where the student was at and where we wanted them to go from there. So this level of differentiation allowed us to start out a period with students, and they would come in the room, and the night before we would have looked at their beginnings of their stories, and we would have said, okay, so again, as teachers, we're using this rubric along the way. We're using this rubric from the start instead of just at the end to evaluate day-to-day learning and to think about ways we can improve it. So having looked the night before at the different students' rubrics, we then said, let's put them just with the two categories that they need to look at. So if they're level 1 right now in terms of their writing, let's give them the level 2 or the level 1 and the level 2, and let's have them really analyze where they need to move from there. If we have some of our students that are higher level, so there's the 1 to the 2 up at the top. So a student that's at the 1 just showed what's happening and told where the story is happening. And all I want them to do that first time when they come in to revise is I want them to move from a 1 to a 2. Because what we found in the past is when they're at the 1 and we give them this rubric and we say, get to the 3. And again, it's this idea of asking them to leap up several steps instead of just taking it one stair at a time. And so what we did is we started off with stations where the students would come in, and if you're a level 1, you would start here. And you would just have the 1 and the 2. And from a planning perspective, again, I would have made my story even more simplistic so they could see examples of the level 1 and the level 2 together. And students could compare, what did they see, what did they notice was the difference between the 1 and the 2. And then they would make a list, similar to the checklist I showed before. What could they add to their story to move it to the next level? The student would then go in and try that, and once their story was at the level 2, they might be ready then to move on. So they could move to the next station. They could move to the same table as students who had come in at the level 2 that were working to move to the level 3. We also, for our students that were ready, we had our higher level groups as well. So they were already at this level 3, and they were ready to move to a level 4. And at a center like this, it might have looked like not only my modeling of a level 4, but perhaps some mentor texts that were even higher level, that they could try to name some things that they could do and take their story to the next level as well. So in planning for this, as a teacher, I was also creating my own checklist. I was creating things that I was able to do in my modeling so that by the time the students came in for the station's work, I had actually written 4 versions of my story because I wanted the students to see the growth progression from starting at my very basic, I showed what's happening and told where my story was happening, all the way up to my level 4, where I establish a narrator, describe many details, and get my story moving with a bigger problem or idea, as well as hint at important details that will be coming up later in my story. So throughout that period, some students might stay the whole time at one station. They might stay here from the 1 to a 2, just working on moving from there. Some students might have moved from a 1 to a 2 and then also gone to the station and moving from a 2 to a 3 in the same class period. And their papers actually grew a lot further in one class period because, again, they were taking sort of concrete, actionable, but very small steps at one time instead of trying to make big leaps all at the same time. So this was something that we tried out, we played around with. Kids seemed to really be able to grab onto. And what we found, especially for students who might have speech issues, speech and language processing things, by looking at a smaller group of criteria at a time, they were able to really say, oh, okay, I can do that. I can do that one small thing that you're asking of me. So this is what we did. We took it a row at a time. We tried throughout the process. We then broke it down even further for some of our classes to put them into groups. And so we said, let's not even focus on one row. We said, let's focus on just 2 boxes within that row. And what was interesting is as we started doing this, we found that we were designing this to help the students, but it was helping us as the teachers as well, which is always a wonderful accident when this happens. Because what we found was that by isolating one row of the rubric ourselves as teachers, we began to ask better questions of ourselves. So we would ask such questions as, oh, is this lesson actually targeted towards a rigorous enough standard? Because sometimes accidentally, maybe my modeling wasn't as good as it needed to be. Or if it wasn't, is it because it was part of a carefully scaffolded plan that would eventually lead to the higher level work? So, for example, when I modeled beginning at a level 2, is because I felt it would open the doorway easier for students, and they actually, more of them got to the level 3 faster. The other thing that it really helped us to do and helped us to think about was just today, not overall with this whole big writing project, but just today, what am I looking for as I work with students? So, for example, when I started this work of modeling my beginnings, in the past, when I was looking at student work, I was really looking at their setting details. I wanted to make sure that they had established this vivid setting, or maybe I was looking that they had set up the characters really well. But when I really focused in on this row of the rubric, I realized we also wanted that hint about the problem. And I realized that wasn't something I had really been looking for in the past, because when I have the whole rubric in my head, when I have all the different categories, it's really hard to focus on the little nuances, the little things that make the writing that much better. So it was sort of a happy accident that by doing some of this, we found, oh, okay, this is actually creating little mini rubrics in our heads, little checklists in our heads that can better show us what it is we're looking for in terms of our students each and every day as we go around in conference. So as a result of this looking at the student work more deeply and as creating this criteria, like I said, we found that our students with learning disabilities and our English language learners especially sort of had this eureka moment, and it was this sort of, thank you, why didn't you tell me this before? Why didn't you just tell me this is what you wanted? And as a teacher, we said, well, sorry, we thought that's what we were doing when we were modeling, and we thought that's what we were doing when we were giving you this giant rubric, but you're right, we should have just told you for this one day, this is more what I want. So it's resulted, we've started looking at it, again, this idea of developing more of the mini rubrics and the little checklists along the way, to our boards looking more like this, so that each day we've got a definition of what it is that we want, what it is that will show us that we know you've got it, what it is that's going to show us that you've successfully done what we've asked for today. So this is an example of a teacher's board from a few days ago in our school, because as we began trying this learning work, they said, you know, you're right, like I'm so frustrated with them that they're not writing more, because I model more and I model that I want 3 details from the text, why aren't they doing it? And then when we put the rubric criteria very clearly up on the board, and for some of our students with speech and language issues, we would also copy it onto a Post-it and put it in front of them at their desk. And what we found is the students began to use it like a daily checklist, like a rubric list. And suddenly they were doing all of the things that we wanted them to do, because again, we weren't trying to trick them. We were just showing them this is what we want. So the last way I want to show you to use rubrics is more for the students again than the teachers, because I feel as teachers we do a good job of using rubrics, but how do we get the students to use them? So the last big idea that we started playing around with is having the students use their rubrics to defend their own learning. For those of you that are in Common Core heavily focused schools, this actually, I believe, ties into the reading standards and close reading, as students have to make a claim, in this case that their work is grade level, and then they have to support that claim with the evidence from their own writing. So they're actually now using the analysis of their own writing to defend their learning. So I'm going to show you what that would look like. Well, I say I'm going to show you what that will look like. There we go. So in this case, a student has to defend that they've met the criteria, and they're going to actually look down at the rubric, and they're going to highlight and show specific things that they believe prove they've done what the rubric asked of them. So I might model this for students by saying, you know, one thing that we ask of students as storytellers, so this is just the narrative techniques row of the rubric. One thing that we ask of our students as storytellers, if you're in 6th grade, one thing you should be able to do is you should show why characters act the way they do. That's something that you should show. And oftentimes our students say, yeah, I did that, I'm done. And so I would say to them, prove it to me. The same way I would say, prove it to me if you're going to make the claim that PETA is actually the strongest, fighter in the Hunger Games arena. I'm going to say, prove it to me. You have to find the text details. So similarly, if you say you have level 3 writing, you have to prove it to me. So I would model this. I'd say, okay, I'm going to use my yellow highlighter, and I'm going to go into my text, and I'm going to find examples of when I showed why characters acted the way they did. So here's a section of my writing, and I'm going to read it. I'm going to see, can you see an example of why a character acted the way they did? Come on. We may as well do something. Want to see who can swing highest? Natalie looked at me. She saw my hopeful expression and grinned. Yeah, maybe we can actually swing so high we flip all the way over the top of the swing set. We raced over to the swings and jumped on. Okay, so I'm going to stop there because I was required to show why characters acted the way they did. And I believe that right here is an example of that. Because if I'm wondering, why did Natalie go with me over to the swing set in the first place? It's because she saw my hopeful expression. So I'm going to write off to the side, shows why Natalie went to the swings. So again, we're using this rubric analysis to actually have the students do close readings of their own work, to actually have students go in and defend their own learning and prove that they actually met the criteria. They have to analyze that. They have to prove that to us. So I would model one like this where I would prove it to them. And then I would say, all right, but I still don't believe you that you're a level 3. I still am not convinced. You have to convince me. So now I want you to take this pink highlighter, and I want you to find an example in your story that shows this component, that shows what the relationship between characters is like. So now you're going to take your pink highlighter, and I'm going to have my students help me with this one. So we're looking for a line in the story that shows what the relationship is like. So I'm going to read this section again. Come on, we may as well do something. Want to see who can swing highest? Natalie looked at me. She saw my hopeful expression and grinned. Yeah, maybe we can actually swing so high we flip all the way over the top of the swing set. We raced over to the swings and jumped on. I pumped my legs really hard. Could you really flip over? I wondered to myself. The swings squeaked and groaned as we swung faster and faster. Woohoo! There you go, you're gonna do it! I yelled to Natalie in encouragement. Can anyone find an example of where I show a relationship between the characters? And the students pointed this out, and of course they might not have used the same words, but they said, yeah, right here, they said, we know what kind of friendship you have. Because you didn't say, you're stupid, you're never going to swing over the top of the swing set. You were encouraging. So right here, I'm going to write relationship is good. These were the words my students gave me. Relationship is good, and we encourage each other. So now when a student says to me, yes, I know my work is a level 3, it's no longer just like, yeah, I checked my work, it's great. It's, I have actually gone through and I have evidence to prove to you how I know my work is a level 3. So there were two big things that we wanted to accomplish when we started out on this rubric work quest. The first thing I wanted to accomplish is that the rubric no longer was that finite ending judgment point. I wanted to accomplish that the rubric was a springboard for further work, and that the rubric was an interactive tool that we're using along the way, and it's something that the students are using to understand not just the grading criteria, but they're using it to understand the stepping stones they need to take to get to the grade level criteria. So it's no longer just like, oh, I got a 2 on this paper. It's now, right now I'm a 2, but I know what I need to do to move to that level 3. So the first big thing I feel like we started to accomplish by breaking down the rubric into these smaller chunks, sometimes breaking it down as far as just 2 of the 4, further breaking it down by coming up with a simple list of things that students needed to do that day. And again, especially for your lower level students, for language learners, for people with ADHD that might not have heard your directions the first times, having this simple checklist of things that they can do gives them that sense of empowerment so that they know what they have to work on, and they know that it's attainable. They know it's something that's a reasonable step to ask of them. The next thing we wanted to accomplish was that not only did they understand what the criteria are, but they could go so far as to analyze their own author's craft to prove that they had done what the rubric was asking them to do. So it's one thing for me to set a goal for myself and to say, I'm going to do these things. And then on the other side of doing that, I have to prove to you that I did them. And in doing all of this, what we found was that teachers were then more concretely aware of what it was they were looking for each day, of what success really did look like for students. So it's easy to have this big box, but it's very hard to then actually know what within that each day I'm looking for when I'm working with students. And if I see a student who was telling stories in the past and they were using good details and action and dialogue, I might have quickly moved on to the next student. But now I know that because I just have this one rubric row in my mind, and I know the deeper details, and I know maybe they did all of those things, but they didn't show how a character responded to something. And maybe I can give them that one little nugget that will help make them a solid grade level writer, as opposed to just quickly saying, yeah, looks good, moving on. So it's this way to sort of really look at the nitty-gritty with each student and to have students look for the nitty-gritty for themselves. And through all of this, we're sort of working as teachers to more deliberately model specific work with those small steps in mind and with the full picture of end success in mind. So that sort of brings me to the end. I would love to hear from other people along this. This is work that I haven't begun embarking on, but on my quest for total student empowerment down the road, I do believe that using rubrics this way is a big part of it. It is a key, because I do believe that by having students analyze and set goals for themselves along the way, and by having students really go in and, again, looking at their own writing as readers and analyzing to defend it against claims and criteria, that we can get them to think of themselves more as empowered writers that know what they need to work on, know what they need to do. I would be curious to hear from you. What are some ways you've found to use rubrics really well in your classroom, or what are some ways you've found to get students to really figure out where they need to move and what they need to do next? So if you have good ideas about rubric work, about student-led goals, about how to get students to that next stage of success, I would be really curious to hear about them. You can share it on the Twitter feed, the Ed Club Gathering, #16. You can also reach out to me on Twitter at Lacy Literacy. And I hope to work with you all again soon on moving students forward with their writing. Thank you so much for joining me today for rethinking the way we use rubrics with students.